Section 4, Computation or Qualia? Dennett specifically recommends a computer model of the brain when trying to imagine how consciousness emerges from the brain. Quote, I have argued that you can imagine how all that complicated slew of activity in the brain amounts to conscious experience. My argument is straightforward. I have shown you how to do it. It turns out that the way to imagine this is to think of the brain as a computer of sorts. The concepts of computer science provide the crutches of imagination we need if we are to stumble across the terra incognito between our phenomenology as we know it by introspection and our brain as science reveals them to us. By thinking of our brains as information processing systems, we can gradually dispel the fog and pick our way across the great divide, discovering how it might be that our brains produce all the phenomena. There are many treacherous pitfalls to avoid, such inviting dead ends as the central mina, filling in, and qualia, for instance. And no doubt there are still some residual confusions and outright errors in the sketch I have provided, but at least we can now see what a path would be like, end quote. But Dennett notes that other philosophers have declared that crossing this divide between the physical brain and consciousness is strictly impossible, quote. Thomas Nagel has claimed that there is no getting to the subjective level of phenomenology from the objective level of physiology. More recently, Colin McGinn has claimed that consciousness has a hidden structure that lies beyond both phenomenology and physiology. And while this hidden structure could bridge the gap, it is probably forever inaccessible to us. The kind of hidden structure I envisage would lie at neither of the levels suggested by Nagel. It would be situated somewhere between them. McGinn goes on to say that neither phenomenological nor physical, this mediating level would not, by definition, be fashioned on the model of either side of the divide, and hence would not find itself able to reach out to the other side. Its characterization would call for radical conceptual innovation, which I have argued is probably beyond us. Quote from McGinn, 1991. However, Dennett rejects McGinn's beyond us conclusion and claims that his own software or virtual machine level of description is exactly the sort of mediating level that McGinn is asking for, not explicitly physiological or mechanical, but capable of providing bridges between brain machinery on the one hand and phenomenological experience on the other. Dennett then exclaims triumphantly, quote, "We've done it. We have imagined how a brain could produce conscious experience. Why does McGinn think it is beyond us to engage in this radical conceptual innovation? Does he subject the various software approaches to the mind to a rigorous and detailed analysis that demonstrates their futility. No, he doesn't examine them at all. He doesn't even try to imagine the intermediate level he posits. He just notes that it seems obvious to him that there is nothing to hope for from this quarter, end quote. However, while Dennett has been busy trying to replace traditional dualist accounts of the origin of consciousness with computational processes, other researchers have been looking for biological, embodied, and emotional energetic explanations for qualia. Jeffrey Gray, for example, reports several experiments indicating that various animals, such as cats and monkeys, demonstrate intentionality in their perception. In one experiment, a pattern of stimulation on the monkey's retina was constant, yet the monkey sometimes reported a starburst and sometimes a face. Gray says, quote, "This is just the kind of phenomenon that philosophers include in their concept of intentionality. That is to say, a constant input from the world outside is interpreted as this or as that." Gray comments that any attempts by cognitive neuroscientists to interpret these results without attributing qualia and intentionality would be strained indeed. Gray comments that, quote, "We cannot ask a rat or a mouse if it feels pain, but we can observe its speed of withdrawal from a hot surface. Rodents respond to opiates just as human beings do. They do so because their brains contain the same receptors for opiates and the same endogenous opiates that act upon these receptors as does the human brain. We could maintain that, nevertheless, only human beings experience pain, just as we could maintain the Ptolemaic view of the heavens, despite the observations made by Copernicus. But it just isn't parsimonious to do so, especially since observations like these can readily be multiplied many times over," end quote. So Gray concludes that animals do have qualia and intentionality. He also suggests that experimenters may be well on the way to finding the neural mechanisms that underlie intentionality and even eventually for qualia. In a very similar way, Jörg Panksepp also insists that all other mammals, and perhaps other species, do have subjective emotional qualia. He says that conventional neuroscience implies that, quote, "affects can only occur either in animals that are intelligent enough to interpret emotional physiology or in animals that have language. This would mean that only human beings, and perhaps some other primates, are affective creatures. Presumably, less intelligent mammals copulate without lust, attack without rage, cower without fear, and nurture without affection," end quote.